I'm Hannah Cole, 35 years old, and the night my mother told me my presence would ruin a family trip, I was standing in her kitchen, holding a bowl of salad like it was a shield. My kids were in the living room laughing at an old cartoon, while my parents and my sister sat around the table, pretending this was just another Sunday dinner. My mom's voice was soft when she said it, the way you talk when you're trying not to wake a sleeping baby. Next week is just special, Hannah. You being there would complicate things. My dad didn't flinch. He just added, "You've changed. You don't really fit with us anymore." For a second, I thought I'd misheard them, that maybe they were joking, but the way nobody laughed told me everything I needed to know. That was the moment I realized I wasn't really their daughter in their eyes anymore. I was the one who signed the checks, nothing more. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the only time family remembered you was when they needed your money or your help. I grew up believing family was supposed to be a circle you could always step back into, no matter how far life took you. My parents, Linda and George, raised my sister and me in a small one-story house on the edge of a mid-sized town in California, where the summers smelled like cut grass and hot asphalt, and the winters were mostly rain and gray skies. Dad worked long shifts as a mechanic, and Mom picked up hours at the school cafeteria, and they drilled the same lesson into us, over and over. We take care of our own. Back then, taking care of our own meant sharing hand-me-down clothes and splitting a single milkshake on the rare nights we could afford fast food. It meant patching things up instead of throwing them away. It meant saying yes when someone in the family needed you, even if it cost you sleep or comfort. As we got older, though, that lesson seemed to land differently on me than it did on my sister. Megan was always the light one, the baby, the girl who could forget an assignment or skip a shift and still have everyone rushing in to cushion her fall. I was the steady one, the responsible one, the girl who found after-school jobs, filled out financial aid forms, and learned how to stretch every dollar. When I left for college on a scholarship and later moved into consulting, my income slowly crept into a place my parents had never known. I wasn't rich by any stretch, but my bills were paid on time, my kids had health insurance, and there was a little cushion in my account. My parents and Megan still lived close to where we grew up, in the same world of overdue notices and maxed-out credit cards, and more often their calls started with a sigh and ended with me entering my card number into some website for them. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I was a single mom balancing client calls with school pickups, soccer practices, and bedtime stories. Lily loved drawing and left trails of markers and paper wherever she went, and Jacob followed her like a shadow clutching a stuffed dinosaur that had lost an eye years ago. We lived in a modest townhouse about 40 minutes from my parents, just far enough that I could breathe, but close enough that Sunday dinners still felt mandatory. I drove over most weekends with a casserole or a dessert, my kids chattering in the back seat, because I wanted them to have grandparents, and I wanted to believe that if I kept showing up, maybe that old circle of we take care of our own was still there. Sunday dinners at my parents' house never really changed. Mom made too much food humming to herself as she shuffled between the stove and the table, and Dad gave the same rundown of sports scores and neighborhood gossip. Megan arrived a little late more often than not, sweeping in with Brian behind her, talking about school fundraisers and how tight money was that month. The plates were mismatched, the chairs creaked, and the television in the corner stayed on with the sound low, always tuned to some game or news show. Underneath all of that, there was this quiet understanding that when a bill couldn't be paid, I would see what I could do, and when a crisis came up, I would help out just this once. Just this once had stretched into years. One particular Sunday, about 6 months before everything unraveled, dinner felt different before I even took off my coat. Mom had lit candles on the table, the good dishes were out, and there was a bottle of wine open that I knew she wouldn't have bought on her own. After we'd all filled our plates and the kids had run off to the hallway with their toys, she folded her hands and looked at me with that careful, almost rehearsed expression. "I've had this dream for years," she said. Taking the whole family to Europe while the kids are still little enough to think it's magic. She talked about cobblestone streets, old churches, and the way she imagined all of us together, 3 generations, wandering through museums and markets, the kind of trip people talk about for the rest of their lives. Megan jumped in quickly, saying how she and Brian had talked about it, but it was just impossible right now, with the mortgage and the kids' activities and everything else. Dad nodded like the math had already been done in his head. Then Mom turned to me and mentioned my new consulting contract, how proud they were that I was doing so well, how this could be our chance to finally have that big memory as a family. The room went quiet in that way it does when everyone already knows what answer they're waiting for. I felt my cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with a strange mix of pressure and hope. I wanted that picture too, my children holding gelato on some old stone street, my parents smiling instead of worrying about the cost of everything. I told her I would help cover the upfront costs, that I could put the flights and reservations on my card, and they could pay me back little by little if they wanted. Mom's shoulders dropped with relief. Dad thanked me in his gruff way, and Megan said, "You're a lifesaver, Han. We'd never pull this off without you." On the drive home that night, with Lily asleep against her window and Jacob humming to the radio, I let myself imagine the version of that trip, where I wasn't just the one making it possible. In my mind, I was in the photos walking beside them, finally part of something instead of hovering at the edges. I wired the money later that week, transferred deposits, and watched the confirmation emails roll in, believing I was helping build a once-in-a-lifetime memory for all of us, not knowing that to them, I was never meant to be on that plane at all. I didn't think much about the itinerary after I wired the money. I knew Megan liked taking charge of plans, so I figured she'd send updates as things came together. A few weeks passed quietly. Work was busy, the kids had their school routines, and life moved in its usual small circles. One afternoon, Lily sat near the sliding door, painting a picture of the ocean, while Jacob napped on the couch, one hand still wrapped around his dinosaur. I was scrolling through my email when a subject line caught my eye. Final itinerary, Florence, Rome, Amalfi. It came from Megan's address, forwarded without a message, almost like an afterthought. I opened it and waited for my name to appear somewhere, expecting to see the full list of travelers. Instead, I found only 6 names printed neatly across the top, my parents Megan and Brian and their 2 children. I read it again slower this time, thinking maybe I'd misread or a page was missing, but every detail confirmed it. The trip I had paid for was complete, and my children and I were not part of it. The pages scrolled on for several screens, each stop more elaborate than the one before. A luxury suite overlooking Florence, a private boat tour along the Amalfi coast, a vineyard dinner under string lights, and a guided walk through the Colosseum. Every reservation showed my card as the payment method. The more I read, the more unreal it felt. There wasn't a note included, not even a casual, "we'll talk soon," just a finished trip perfectly arranged with my family's names, but not mine. I set my phone down and listened to the soft clicks of Lily rinsing her brushes at the kitchen sink. The sun from the window stretched across the floor, bright and warm, but I felt oddly still. I checked the document again, searching for any mention of adding more travelers later, but nothing ever appeared. Their silence had said more than any explanation would have. I waited a day before mentioning anything. I thought maybe Megan would reach out, maybe one of my parents would call, but the house stayed quiet, except for the sounds of bedtime routines and the hum of everyday life. By Sunday, I knew I needed to hear their explanation in person. I bundled the kids into the car and made the familiar drive to my parents' house, passing the same streets I'd known since childhood. When we walked in, everything looked the same as it always did for family dinner. Mom set out her baked pasta, Dad talked about some new neighborhood construction, and Megan commented about a fundraiser at school. The calmness felt practiced, as if they'd rehearsed this moment. I kept waiting for someone to say something, but no one did. Dinner moved along like any other evening. After a few minutes, I passed the salad bowl across the table and said as evenly as I could, "Italy must be beautiful this time of year." The silence that followed landed with weight. Mom set down the bread she was holding. Megan glanced at me briefly, then back at her plate. Brian reached for his drink a little too quickly. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. "Next week is a special trip, Hannah. We didn't want any extra stress." She said it calmly, almost kindly, as if she were being thoughtful. Then my dad added, "You've changed. It's like you don't fit with us anymore." I looked from one face to the next, trying to understand the meaning behind their words. No one offered an apology. No one suggested a mistake. No one said the children and I had been included and something got mixed up. Instead, they focused on the disruption I would have caused. Megan didn't raise her head. She just kept chewing slowly, as if the moment didn't really involve her. It was clear they had talked about this long before I arrived. They had decided how to frame it, chosen their reasons, and settled on their tone. Everything had been prepared, except for my reaction. I touched my fork against my water glass lightly, a small sound that seemed to echo through the room. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to ask. I finished my meal, helped the kids put on their coats, and thanked them for dinner. As we walked out, the cool night air felt sharper than usual. The drive home was quiet, except for Lily humming a tune she had learned in music class, and Jacob mumbling softly as he drifted back to sleep. They didn't know what had just happened, didn't know they had been left out of something that was supposed to be for the whole family. But I did. Once the kids were asleep, I sat at my desk with the itinerary still open on my phone. Every reservation, every ticket, every confirmation had my name attached to it. They hadn't even tried to change the billing details. The sunlight from earlier had turned into the soft glow of the table lamp, and the house felt unusually still. I clicked through each page and felt a slow, steady understanding settle in. This wasn't about money or logistics or misunderstandings. They had planned a trip to find us family, and they had chosen to leave us out deliberately. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't ask for a conversation or an explanation. Instead, I made tea, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and scrolled through the itinerary one more time. The kids' drawings were scattered across the table, overlapping with printouts of flight numbers and hotel confirmations. The contrast felt sharp, but it clarified something in a way that words never could. Whatever they had decided about us, they had done it on purpose, and they had assumed I would simply accept it. As the playlist Lily liked to use on our weekend mornings played softly in the background, I reviewed each line on the screen. I didn't feel the heat of anger, just a steady, focused quiet, as I checked every reservation linked to my name. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The trip they planned without us was completely funded by the account I managed alone. They had used the lesson they had once taught me, take care of your own, but twisted it into something unrecognizable. The house was quiet when I went to bed, but a different kind of clarity had settled in. In the morning, life moved as it usually did. The kids had breakfast. Jacob asked for extra syrup. Lily packed her colored pencils for school. But beneath the routine, something had changed. I wasn't waiting for their explanation anymore. I knew exactly what the next step had to be, and it wouldn't involve raising my voice or asking for space at their table. It would start quietly with the same calm they had used when they told me I wasn't part of their plans. And as I walked the kids to the car that morning, I felt the beginning of that shift take root, steady measured, and certain, pointing me toward a decision they would never have seen coming. The morning after that Sunday dinner, the house felt unusually quiet, even with the familiar sounds of breakfast being made, and Lily reminding Jacob not to spill syrup on the table. I moved through the motions of our routine, packing lunches, checking backpacks, tying shoes, but there was a heaviness underneath everything. The words from the night before kept replaying in a slow, steady loop, not loud, just persistent. When I dropped the kids at school, Lily waved from the curb with her usual bright smile, and Jacob pressed his face to the window until I pulled away. Once they were out of sight, the silence in the car felt bigger than the space around me. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes after getting home, staring at the garage door like it held an answer. Inside the house was filled with the morning sun, and the drawings the kids had left on the table were still scattered from the night before. I picked them up one by one, smoothing the edges, and felt something settle inside me, a sort of stillness that wasn't numbness, but close to it. The itinerary was still open on my laptop at the desk, and when I saw the screen, the details felt sharper than they had the night before. The hotel names, the reservation codes, the little notes Megan had written about directions or dress codes, all carefully arranged without a single thought of us. I sat down and scrolled through it again, not searching for my name anymore, just taking in what had been done. That afternoon, the kids crashed on the couch with a movie while I folded laundry at the kitchen counter. I moved quietly, watching the rhythm of everyday life continue as if nothing had happened. There was a strange comfort in the simple tasks, stacking clothes, matching socks, smoothing out wrinkles, things that made sense even when everything else didn't. When the phone buzzed on the counter, I glanced at it, half expecting someone in the family to reach out with an explanation, but it was only a reminder from the school office. Nothing in my family thread. Nothing from my parents. Nothing from Megan. The silence lasted all week. No one called to follow up. No one asked how I felt, and no one mentioned the dinner at all. It was as if they thought the conversation had gone exactly as planned, and everyone had agreed on the outcome. At odd moments in the carpool line in the grocery store, while brushing my teeth at night, I would remember the way my mother had said special, like it was a code for something I wasn't meant to understand. I didn't cry, though. It wasn't the kind of hurt that spilled over. It was the kind that sat low and steady, tightening its grip only when the house got quiet. By Friday, the weight of that whole week seemed to settle into my shoulders. Lily worked on her reading at the dining table, while Jacob built a tower out of wooden blocks near her chair. Their voices blended with the ticking of the wall clock, and everything around me looked ordinary. But the more I watched them, the clearer it became that they had no idea my family had closed a door on them before they even got a chance to walk through it. When Jacob looked up to show me his tower, his grin still had that pure openness only 5-year-olds have, and something inside me tightened. That night, after they were asleep, I walked through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. I stood at the sliding door for a moment and watched the porch light flicker softly against the fence. There was always a calm at that hour when the noise of the day had died down. I picked up the itinerary again, not to dissect it this time, but to understand the picture it painted. 6 names, moving through Italy, 6 sets of tickets, 6 travelers sharing food and memories, all paid for by someone who wasn't even invited. I had paid for moments I would never see laughter, I wouldn't hear, and photos I would never appear in. Yet everything was so carefully arranged, it was clear they'd never planned to include us at all. Saturday morning arrived with its usual chaos. Lily had a school project to finish, and Jacob wanted pancakes shaped like animals. I poured batter onto the pan, letting the sound of its sizzle drown out the thoughts circling in my mind. While the kids ate, I checked emails on my phone. There were new confirmations from the travel company receipts that had automatically forwarded to me, and updates that proved every part of the trip was finalized. All of it sat at the top of my inbox, unavoidable and firm. I deleted nothing. I needed to see it clearly. After lunch, we drove to the park. The kids ran across the grass, chasing each other between the swings and the slide. I watched them from a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, listening to their laughter carry across the playground. A couple of parents sat nearby, chatting about weekend plans and holiday trips. Their voices drifted toward me, pieces of conversations blending into the breeze. I sat with my hands clasped together, thinking about the moment my parents had dismissed us from the trip without hesitation. The contrast felt stark, my children running freely in front of me, while my own family had chosen to move forward without them. When we got home that afternoon, Lily colored on the living room floor, while Jacob lined up toy cars along the coffee table. I reheated leftovers for dinner and kept my movements slow and steady, as if rushing would break something fragile in the room. After I tucked them into bed, I lingered a little longer than usual, brushing hair from Lily's forehead and pulling Jacob's blanket up to his chest. Their breaths softened into sleep, and the room filled with the quiet rhythm that always came once they drifted off. Back in the kitchen, I stood with my hands braced on the counter. The itinerary was still on the table, where I'd left it printed and folded. I opened it again, flattening the creases with my palm. There was no anger, just a growing clarity like fog lifting from a familiar road. They had taken my contribution and used it to build something that didn't include me. More than that, they had spoken as if my presence would have ruined it. The truth sat plainly between the lines of every reservation. They had decided where we belonged, and it wasn't with them. Sunday morning came, and with it a quiet sense of finality. I brewed coffee, set out cereal for the kids, and listened to the low hum of the refrigerator. Nothing about the day was unusual, yet everything felt different. I watched Lily draw at the table, while Jacob talked to himself in small bursts, making his toy dinosaur march across his plate. Their world was uncomplicated, still insulated from the choices others had made. I knew I couldn't protect them from everything, but I could protect them from being dismissed without a second thought. Later that afternoon, I took the printed itinerary and placed it in the drawer of my desk, sliding it on top of old school papers and receipts. Not to hide it, but to keep it close. I wasn't sure yet what I would do, only that the silence I'd endured all week had shaped something firm in me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady and deliberate. I checked the clock, letting the soft click of each second pass mark the beginning of something new. When the kids curled up beside me on the couch to watch a movie that evening, I wrapped my arms around them and kept my eyes on the screen. I didn't speak about the trip. I didn't bring up the dinner. I didn't rehearse any conversation in my head. Instead, I let the quiet settle fully, knowing that silence had its own weight, its own purpose. And by the time I carried Jacob to his bed that night, I knew that the stillness I'd been living in all week wasn't the end of anything. It was the space before a decision, the breath before a shift, the moment right before a line is redrawn. The week after I tucked the itinerary into my desk drawer, moved slowly, almost like the days were stretching themselves out on purpose. I carried on with the kids' routines, packed lunches, reviewed Lily's spelling words, and helped Jacob zip his jacket before school. On the surface, everything looked the same, but underneath something had shifted. It wasn't anger or even sadness anymore. It felt more like a quiet steadiness settling into place, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken. I found myself moving through each day with a new clarity, noticing the small things with sharper focus. The things I used to overlook now felt like gentle reminders to pay attention. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table after the kids had fallen asleep, the glow of the overhead light washing over the room. The printed itinerary lay beside my laptop, the edges still creased from being folded so many times. I opened it slowly and scanned the pages again, but this time the details no longer stung the way they had before. Instead, they revealed a pattern I hadn't allowed myself to see. Every reservation, every deadline, every decision, each choice had been made without a moment of hesitation about leaving us behind. The realization didn't bring a wave of emotion. It brought a calm, steady certainty that something needed to change. In the quiet of the house, I took out the receipts and emails I had saved over the past months and spread them out across the table. The kids' drawings were still pinned to the refrigerator, and the soft hum of the dishwasher filled the background. One by one, I reviewed every charge I had covered, the deposits I had fronted, and the confirmations issued in my name. They had treated me like the one who handled the finances for the group, never considering what that meant for me or the children. The more I looked at it, the less complicated it became. The truth was printed plainly in black and white. I had funded a trip they never intended for us to join. As the night deepened, I made tea and wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the steam rise quietly in the air. The calm inside me grew stronger, not heavy or sharp, but deliberate. I opened the travel account on my laptop, the one I had set up months earlier, so everyone could access tickets and updates. The login still had my name, and the reminders for upcoming travel dates were lined up neatly. I clicked through each section, noting how little effort it would take to reverse what had been done. The idea didn't feel vengeful. It felt measured and necessary. It wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me without permission. Before I made any decision, I walked down the hall to check on the kids. Lily had pushed her blanket down to her feet, and I pulled it back over her, brushing her hair off her forehead. Jacob slept curled on his side, his stuffed dinosaur tucked tightly against his chest. The room was warm and peaceful, and for a moment I stood there letting their quiet breaths fill the space around me. They deserved better than to grow up thinking exclusion was normal. They deserved to know that when someone showed you where you stood, you listened. In the morning, the house filled with its usual Saturday sounds. Lily asked for her favorite cereal, and Jacob wanted to help whisk the eggs for breakfast. Their chatter brought a softness to the room that cut through the heaviness of the previous week. After breakfast, Lily spread her colored pencils across the kitchen table and started a new drawing of a lighthouse she had seen in a book from school. Jacob sat beside her, tapping the table with a spoon, pretending it was a drum. I watched them, feeling the strength of that stillness inside me deepen. I didn't need anyone to validate what I knew. I didn't need an apology to move forward. I needed to act in a way that protected the three of us. That afternoon, after I tucked the itinerary back into the drawer, I sat on the couch with a notebook and listed everything I had paid for. Flights, hotels, tours, rail passes, all of it had been fronted by me. Not because I'd been pressured, but because I had believed the word family held a place for everyone. Each line I wrote made the picture clearer. They had taken advantage of my willingness, assuming I would keep giving without hesitation. The thought didn't bring bitterness. It brought a kind of awakening that made everything feel lighter, as if I had finally stepped out of a dim room and into clean daylight. Sunday came and we stayed home instead of visiting my parents' house. I made pancakes and the kids helped stir the batter. We played a board game on the living room rug, and the afternoon passed without rush or expectation. I didn't check my phone. I didn't glance at the clock. The stillness I'd been carrying shifted into something firmer, something close to resolve. I was done waiting for the kind of recognition I had always hoped would come. I no longer needed to ask where we fit. They had already answered that question. Later that night, once the kids were asleep, I returned to the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked in the login box for the travel portal. I typed in my information and waited for the dashboard to load. Everything was laid out the way it had been the night before, but now I saw it with a new sense of ownership. They had set the terms of their trip. Now I would set mine. I didn't rush. I didn't feel compelled to act quickly or dramatically. Instead, I clicked through each section and took my time making sure I understood every step before moving forward. Every action I took felt deliberate and calm, grounded in the certainty that had been building all week. I didn't think about what they would say or how they would react. The focus stayed on the truth that sat plainly in front of me. They had defined the boundaries, and I was responding in the space they had created. When I finally closed the laptop, the house was silent, except for the soft click of the hallway thermostat turning on. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of that calm settle fully for the first time. The decision had formed naturally, shaped by their choices, not mine. I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the bedrooms, knowing the next part of this story wasn't rooted in emotion or explanation. It was rooted in clarity. And by the time I slipped into bed, the stillness that had been lingering all week had taken a new shape: quiet, strength patient, and steady, waiting for the moment when everything would shift. The morning after that quiet decision settled inside me. The house felt lighter than it had in weeks. Lily sat at the kitchen table working on a school project while Jacob pushed his toy cars across the floor with soft, focused hums. I made breakfast with a calm I hadn't felt in a long time, flipping pancakes while sunlight streamed through the blinds in thin, warm lines. Everything around me looked ordinary, but something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. When I glanced at the laptop on the counter, the travel portal login still waiting from the night before, I knew what I needed to do next. Once the kids were distracted, I opened the computer and logged in. The dashboard loaded quickly, showing every reservation I had paid for flights, hotel suites, tours, transfers, and special events, all laid out in the order they were meant to be enjoyed. The cursor blinked at the top of the screen, steady and expectant. I clicked into the first reservation, a set of first-class tickets departing in a few days. The page asked if I wanted to cancel. My mouse hovered for a breath before I pressed the button. A confirmation window appeared and I clicked again. The tickets vanished from the screen as soon as the request was processed. I moved on to the next booking. I canceled the hotel suites next. Each reservation disappeared with a soft confirmation tone, the computer handling everything with smooth efficiency. The private tours went next, along with the vineyard dinner and the boat reservations. Every step was reversible clean and documented each refund returning to the account that had been used to pay for it in the first place. The process was quiet, almost methodical, and the house stayed steady around me as I worked. When everything was complete, I logged into the travel portal settings and changed the password to something new, something only I would remember. I paused for a moment before clicking save, but there was no hesitation left in me. Jacob wandered over asking for a snack, and I put the laptop aside long enough to cut up some fruit and pour him a cup of water. He sat on the couch with his small feet tucked under him, eating happily while watching a cartoon he had seen dozens of times. When he was settled, I returned to the computer and finished the last few steps. The car service was canceled, the QR codes were invalidated, the digital passes were deactivated. Nothing was left undone. Later that morning, I helped Lily pack a bag for a school donation drive, folding shirts she'd outgrown and placing them into a neatly sealed box. She told me about a new book her class was reading, her voice soft and animated. As she talked, I felt a steady warmth in my chest. There was no guilt in what I had done, no uncertainty. I wasn't undoing a gift. I was reclaiming something that had been taken from us without permission. At precisely 7:52 a.m., my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw a text from Brian. "Unblock the account now." The words were clipped and hurried. I set the phone back down without replying right away. A moment later, another alert appeared, this time from my mother. "What did you do?" Then a message from Megan with a photo of her youngest daughter crying. The kids were excited. "Why would you do this to them?" I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a simple reply to Brian. "Sorry, I guess I'm just too different now." When I hit send, I felt the last of the tension in my shoulders ease. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I made lunch for the kids and spent some time helping Lily with her reading. The house felt settled, steady, and calm. Later that afternoon, I took the kids to the park. They ran across the grass, laughing and chasing each other under the soft winter sun. I watched them from a bench, feeling the weight of the past weeks slowly lift. There was no bitterness in the space around us, just clean air and easy laughter. As evening approached, we made pizza dough from scratch, something Lily loved doing because she liked dusting the counter with flour. Jacob sprinkled too much cheese on one half, declaring it his section of the pizza. Their joy filled the room in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. For once, I wasn't thinking about what my family expected or how they would react to anything I did. Everything was focused on the three of us, and the simplicity of that felt like a breath of fresh air. The kids were getting ready for bed when I checked my phone again. The screen was filled with missed calls and new messages. Megan's latest text read, "Why are we being denied boarding?" followed by another from my father. "Did you cancel the flights?" They had apparently reached the airport only to find there were no tickets for them to claim. I could picture the scene clearly. My mother demanding answers from the airline staff, my father checking his wallet for backup cards, Megan nervously fussing with her children's backpacks, while Brian tried to stay composed. I set the phone face down on the counter, listening as the kids brushed their teeth in the hallway. The next morning, the house was calm in a way that made everything feel balanced. The kids and I spent the day at home reading books and baking muffins. I didn't hear from my parents again until late that afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find my mother standing there, her hair tied back and her voice softer than usual. She didn't ask to come in. She simply said, "All right, Hannah, you made your point." She talked about how these stunts didn't solve anything, how canceling the trip only widened the gap between us. Then she shifted into a tone I had heard many times before, asking about a contractor who was scheduled for next month. "Your father said you might be able to help with the deposit," she said, as if the last week had never happened. I nodded slowly. "Let me check my accounts. I'll let you know." She seemed relieved, as if I had opened a door she believed was still there. But I knew something had changed, something she hadn't noticed yet. When she left, the house felt even quieter than before, but not empty. It felt like the start of a new chapter. Over the next few days, messages from my family trickled in. Megan sent short-clipped texts asking about the contractor and the backyard plans. My father followed up asking for help with some supplies for winter. Each time I answered the same way they had spoken to me for years, polite, vague, and without commitment. "I'm still checking a few things. I'll circle back soon." There was no anger in my tone, only distance. The silence on their end grew heavier. With each day, I didn't follow through. The balance that had always tipped toward them began to shift. The more space I created, the more they reached out. I didn't push them away. I simply stopped stepping into the role I had carried for so long. By the end of the week, the house felt grounded again. The kids' laughter filled the evenings, and for the first time in months, I slept deeply. As I closed the curtains one night, I felt the calm settle around me fully. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a change they never thought I would make. And the moment that change became undeniable was already on its way, waiting to turn everything in a direction none of us could have predicted. The days following the canceled trip took on a strange quiet. My parents stopped asking about deposits, Megan slowed her messages to almost nothing, and the house felt like it had returned to its old rhythm. Lily practiced her spelling words at the kitchen counter every evening, and Jacob lined up his toy cars on the floor in neat rows before bed. Everything around me began settling into a more peaceful pattern. I didn't check my phone as often, and I didn't expect anything from my family anymore. It was as if the air had cleared, even if the space between us had grown wider. Thanksgiving approached with no mention of dinner plans from anyone. I wasn't surprised. Instead of waiting for an invitation, I planned a simple meal for just the three of us. On the holiday morning, the kids decided they wanted waffles instead of turkey, so I made them a batch and watched them laugh when the shapes didn't quite come out right. We spent the afternoon drawing and watching old movies, the house warm and cozy, while rain tapped against the windows. For the first time in a long while, the day didn't feel like something we were missing out on. It felt complete. A few days later, I ran into a family friend, Erica, in the grocery store parking lot. She greeted me with a hesitant smile before glancing away and asking quietly, "You didn't make it to dinner, did you?" When I shook my head, she nodded as if she'd already known the answer. "Your sister told your grandmother it was just simpler that way." Her words were gentle, but carried the weight of something that wasn't hers to explain. I thanked her, and we parted with a polite exchange, but her comment replayed in my mind the entire drive home. Christmas passed without a single message from my parents or Megan. A neighbor sent me a photo from Megan's social media page showing my parents and her family in matching pajamas by the fireplace. 5 stockings hung above them. None of them had my children's names. I stared at the photo longer than I meant to, taking in each detail until the quiet truth settled in. They weren't just excluding us from one trip or one holiday. They had decided to draw their circle without us. By early January, I found myself checking the mailbox each afternoon out of habit. One cold morning, I opened the box to find a single plain envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. The paper felt thin, and for a moment I just held it, unsure if I wanted to know what was inside. When I finally opened it, a folded check slid out along with a brief note. My mother wrote that they hoped to repair what was left and included my share of the Italy trip since we had not attended. The amount was modest, far less than what I'd spent, but it wasn't the number that stayed with me. It was the way the gesture felt detached, almost transactional, as if the situation could be mended by evening out a bill. I placed the check on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a sunflower Lily had made in art class. It stayed there untouched, blending in among drawings of animals and holiday crafts. 3 days later, a new message appeared on my phone. This time it was from Megan. "Grandma's in the hospital. She's been asking for you." I reread the message before calling the number she provided just to confirm the details. The nurse assured me my grandmother was stable, just being monitored for a mild heart issue, and that she had indeed asked for me. The moment I hung up, I packed a small overnight bag, made arrangements for the kids, and drove north to Sacramento. When I entered her hospital room, she was resting with her hands folded on top of the blanket, her silver hair brushing the pillowcase. Her eyes opened when I stepped inside, and she smiled with the kind of warmth I hadn't felt from anyone in my family for months. "Hannah," she said softly, reaching a hand toward me. "There you are." I pulled a chair closer to her bedside and sat with her hand in mine. She asked how the kids were doing, and once I'd reassured her that they were fine, she looked at me with a quiet seriousness. "Tell me what happened," she said. The words came easier than I expected. I told her everything, not in anger, but in a steady, measured voice. I explained how I had paid for the trip, how I found out about the plans, and how they had told me I didn't fit anymore. I told her about the canceled reservations, the silence that followed, and the holidays we spent on our own. She listened without interrupting, her eyes soft but attentive. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and said, "That's not what they told me. She told me they had said I had refused to join the trip, then canceled everything out of spite. Her voice wavered, not with disbelief, but with a kind of sadness I could feel from across the room. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't know what's happened to them." I stayed with her until she fell asleep. On the drive back home, the sky had turned the pale blue of early evening, and the weight of the conversation sank into the stillness of the car. My phone buzzed before I even reached my driveway. First was a message from my mother. "Did you tell Grandma some twisted version of what happened?" Then Megan. "She's old Hannah. She doesn't need the stress." Then Brian. "You're turning people against their own family. This is toxic behavior." I stared at the screen as the messages stacked one after another. There was no apology, no ownership, just accusation. The next morning, a group text arrived from my parents, Megan and Brian. It read, "We'd like to move forward with more transparency and unity. We're hoping you'll be part of future plans." The shift was sudden and strange, as if my grandmother's understanding had rewritten a script they'd rehearsed for months. The tone wasn't warm. It was cautious, almost strategic, as if my worth had been recalculated overnight. The following day, Megan sent a separate message. "Maybe we could meet for coffee next week. No pressure. Just talk." She added a heart emoji at the end, something she rarely used with me. I stared at her message for a while before responding with a simple, "Tuesday at 10 works." She replied almost immediately, confirming she'd buy the coffee. But on the morning of our meeting at 9:41, I texted, "Sorry, last-minute work meeting. Can we reschedule?" She didn't hesitate. "Of course, let's touch base later this week." There was no follow-up from her. Instead, a day later, my mother reached out again about money. "Would you be able to pitch in a little for gravel delivery? Just need a small contribution." Her tone was light, almost casual, as if we were back to old habits. I told her, "Let me check some things. I'll circle back soon." But I didn't. For the first time in years, the balance between us was shifting in a way they couldn't control. The conversations they once used to keep me tethered no longer held the same weight. I wasn't pushing them away. I was simply stepping out of the space they'd boxed me into. One quiet evening, as I tucked the kids into bed and listened to the soft rhythm of the house settling, I realized something had changed completely. My grandmother knew the truth, and they knew that she knew. That single fact had turned everything. Their stories no longer stood on steady ground. The silence I had carried for so long had finally broken, and somewhere in the space created by that shift, a new kind of strength began to take root, guiding me toward the moment when justice would come into full view, whether they were ready for it or not. In the days after my grandmother learned the truth, the shift in my family's tone grew more noticeable. Messages that once carried a hint of dismissal now came wrapped in softer wording, as if they were trying to repair something without acknowledging what had been broken. Megan stopped pushing for rescheduled coffee dates and instead sent short notes asking how the kids were doing. My parents kept their own messages brief, but they always ended with lines about staying connected and moving forward. I answered each one politely, just as they had taught me for years, but I didn't rush to fill the spaces they left. The balance between us felt different now, quieter and more even. One evening, I found another envelope in the mailbox. I recognized my mother's careful handwriting the moment I saw it. The note inside was brief, almost businesslike. She wrote that she hoped we could reset, and that she and my father were thinking of selling their house. They wanted the proceeds to go into what they called a shared family account, something we could all benefit from. The check she had sent earlier was tucked inside again, folded neatly. There was no apology, just a suggestion that stepping back into place might keep things running smoothly. I slipped the check back into the envelope and tucked it into a drawer without a second thought. 2 days later, Megan called. Her name lit up my phone for several seconds before going to voicemail. She sounded cheerful, her voice light and familiar, as if we'd been talking regularly. She said the kids missed Lily and Jacob, that she'd been thinking about our conversation with Grandma, and that maybe it was time for a real reset. She ended with the same phrase my mother had written about the house sale, helping build something for the future. I replayed her message once before setting the phone aside. There was a time I would have responded right away, wanting to smooth everything over, wanting to keep the peace. But the silence that followed felt more honest. The next morning, as I packed lunches for the kids, I sealed the check back inside the original envelope and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the street. I didn't write a note. I didn't text my mother afterward or send a follow-up message. I simply placed the envelope inside and closed the lid. As I walked back toward the house, the air felt brisk and clean, the kind of cool that settles against your skin and wakes you up gently. It didn't feel like I'd ended something. It felt like I'd let something settle in a place where it had belonged for a long time. A week passed with no messages from my parents, no calls from Megan, and no follow-ups about the house. The group thread stayed empty. On my birthday, the phone sat quiet the entire day. I made a small cake with the kids, and we decorated it with mismatched candles Lily found in the kitchen drawer. They sang to me with wide smiles and sticky fingers, and as I blew out the candles, the room felt full in a way that didn't depend on anyone else. The silence from my family didn't ache the way it used to. It simply existed, filling its own space without crowding mine. One afternoon in early spring, my phone buzzed with a message from Erica. She wrote that my parents had sold the house and moved to a smaller place outside the city. The information arrived simply without judgment or commentary, just a neighbor passing along something she thought I should know. I thanked her and returned to helping Jacob finish a puzzle on the living room rug. Nothing inside me leaned forward or pulled back. The news floated through the room like any other update, ordinary and easy to place where it belonged. In the evenings after the kids had fallen asleep, I sometimes sat at my desk and let the quiet gather around me. The room felt familiar, safe in its own rhythm. Papers were stacked neatly, crayons were tucked into a jar beside Lily's drawings, and Jacob's dinosaur sat on the corner of the desk like it was keeping watch. The more I looked around, the more I understood that our home carried a peace I had spent years reaching for. It didn't come from being welcomed or accepted. It came from finally stepping away from the constant effort to stay included in something that wasn't meant for us. As spring settled in, I took the kids on a short road trip up the coast. We drove through stretches of open highway lined with wildflowers, stopping whenever something caught their interest. We spent a morning walking along the beach near Monterey, collecting pieces of sea glass and letting the tide wash around our ankles. In the evenings, we stayed at a small bed and breakfast with creaky floors and warm biscuits that arrived fresh each morning. The kids loved it, especially the old rocking chair on the porch that creaked with every shift of weight. There was no schedule to follow, no matching outfits or staged photos. The trip felt simple and full, held together by laughter and moments that didn't need to be polished. On the drive home, the kids fell asleep in the back seat, their heads leaning gently against each other. The highway stretched out ahead in a long curve, and the late afternoon sun drifted across the dashboard in soft gold. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to hold anything tightly. The space around us felt open and calm. When we got home, the mailbox was empty. The house smelled faintly of the lavender cleaner I'd used before we left, and the kids headed straight to their rooms to unpack their treasures. I lingered in the quiet for a moment longer, letting the peace of the day stitch itself into the evening. In that soft, steady quiet, I understood that justice hadn't come in a dramatic moment or a bold confrontation. It had arrived slowly in the shape of silence, returned to those who once used it so freely. It had arrived in the way they reached out only when they needed something, and how I no longer felt the urge to rush in. It had arrived in the small steps that reclaimed my time, my space, and my emotional footing. And as I turned off the kitchen light that night, I could feel that the final piece of this story was already beginning to take shape, quiet, steady, and waiting for the moment when everything would come full circle. In the weeks after our trip up the coast, life settled into a steady rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The kids eased back into school, bringing home small treasures from the playground and new stories about classmates. I went back to my work projects, filling my days with calls and quiet hours at my desk, while the afternoon sunlight shifted across the floor. There were no surprise messages from my family, no requests for help, and no sudden attempts to pull me back into their plans. The silence that once felt heavy now rested gently in the background, leaving room for things that actually belonged in my life. One afternoon in early summer, I gathered the mail from the box and sorted through the usual stack of bills and flyers. Near the bottom was another plain envelope with my mother's handwriting on the front. It had no return address, just my name carefully written the way she used to label our school lunches. I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment before opening it. Inside was a short note, more tentative than the others, and the same folded check I had sent back weeks earlier. She wrote that the house had sold and that she and my father were starting over somewhere quieter. She hoped we could find a new beginning in time, but there was no pressure, no request, no assumption. For the first time in a long while, their words didn't ask anything of me. They simply acknowledged the distance. I slipped the note into a drawer and tucked the check beneath it. As I closed the drawer, I realized there was no weight in the decision anymore. I didn't need to explain myself or offer anything in return. Whatever they chose to build from this point forward was theirs alone. The kids and I spent that evening on the back patio, watching fireflies rise from the grass while the sky shifted from gold to blue. Lily braided blades of grass together and asked if we could take another road trip before school started again. Jacob leaned against my side, clutching his favorite dinosaur, and listened to her ideas with sleepy interest. I told them we would not, because I needed to prove anything, but because those moments with them had become the truest parts of my life. As the weeks passed, the quiet between my family and me stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a boundary, clear, steady, and healthy. There were no harsh words, no final argument, just the understanding that we each had chosen our own direction. They had drawn their circle without us, and I had learned how to build a life that didn't depend on being invited inside it. One Saturday morning, I watched the kids chase each other across the living room, their laughter echoing off the walls, and I felt a sense of peace settle in. Not the sharp relief of escape or the shaky calm that follows conflict, but the kind that grows slowly over time. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your place in their world. I hadn't gone searching for justice, but it found its way into the quiet places. It showed up when the truth reached the one person who had always cared. It grew stronger each time I refused to play roles that no longer fit. It took root when I chose my children and myself over old habits that had drained me for years. Justice didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic conclusions. It came in the shape of silence that finally belonged to me. Looking back, the most surprising part wasn't the distance that formed between us. It was discovering how much room there was to breathe once I stopped filling the spaces they left. I learned that peace doesn't always come with a door closing. Sometimes it arrives when you stop reaching for a door that was never meant to open. If my story echoes something in your own life, I hope it reminds you that you're allowed to choose the people who choose you. You're allowed to create a life where your worth isn't measured by what you can give, but by who you become when you're finally standing in your own light. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you feel moved to share your own experience or simply want to hear more stories like this, I'd love for you to leave a comment or stay connected. Your voice matters here.